welcome Frederik Køhlert from the University of East Anglia, who is also the director of comic studies out there, professor at University of East Anglia, director of comic studies. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Frederik, my namesake, so kind of interesting to be talking to another Frederik. In the United States, you don't hear that name very often. And my name, of course, is Luis Federico, but when we moved from Mexico, they gave me the Anglophone Frederik. Yes, so we're not here to talk about our name origins. We're here to talk about you and your work. Frederik, I don't know. So you've trained, you have this really interesting academic sort of journey, right? I mean, you've gone to University of Aarhus, you study Scandinavian literature, you published a book on the Chicago literary experience, and now you're doing comic studies. But I want to hear how this all happened and how you got to comic studies.
Absolutely. So I guess my origin story for comic studies, like everyone else's, I think, in comic studies, is that I used to be obsessed with comics when I was a kid, and I read all the comics I could get my hands on. But the difference was that I grew up in Denmark, and I'm originally from Denmark, so I didn't grow up reading superheroes at all, and I didn't really even, I think, know that superheroes really existed at all. I think characters like Superman or Batman existed only as movie characters for me, because we couldn't, it just wasn't available, all these American superhero comics. So it was always those characters and stories were associated with the movies for me, and I was reading all the Franco-Belgian comics instead, so all the Tintin and the Asterix and all those types of things, and that's what I associated with comics. Along with, of course, all the Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse comics that were made, I think, mostly actually in Europe for a European market. So it's not something that a lot of Americans are even really aware of, that these very American characters have this whole long sort of tradition in Europe as also contemporary comic book characters, right? So I don't think... people in North America tend to think of Donald Duck, as a animation character mostly, right? But there's obviously this whole tradition of the Karl Barks comics from the 40s and 50s, and also then a more contemporary European production. So anyway, so that's what I grew up reading, and then I stopped reading comics, like I think most people also tend to do, right? So then I went to university or high school or whatever, and I started, I was like, oh, now I'm going to be serious and read the serious kinds of books and literature and so on. So then for my studies, I was an Americanist. I studied American literature. That's what I focused on. And it was really only when I was in grad school that I even started reading comics again, and I took this one graduate seminar on the contemporary graphic novel, and we read Joe Sacco and Chris Ware and the Hernandez brothers and sort of these Machan Satrapi and those types of things, and I sort of discovered that we discovered comics and what comics could be and who comics could be made by also, right? Like what kind of creators could make comics in the world, and the kinds of perspectives that they brought to the form. So although I wrote my first book on the literary history of Chicago and much more traditional sort of literary studies area, I kept reading comics and I developed the next project to be an autobiographical comics, because that's sort of where I was just naturally drawn. I think partly because of the wave of autobiographical comics of the last 15, 20 years. But also just because I felt that that's where the most interesting work was being done in terms of issues of identity and representation, which are issues that I'm really interested in. so that project was eventually published last year as Serial Selves, which is on the screen here.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the journey. It's not a very, these two areas don't really, there's not like one developed into the other or anything like that. Really, it's just that there was always this like background of comics that now has sort of like taken over most of my work. Although I am also currently writing a longer book on the literary history of Chicago. So that is also sort of hanging out in the background, but it is mostly comics that I do now.
You ended up with your PhD there at the University of Oregon, of course, which is another important space, academic space, scholarly space in the US for the study of comics. So yeah, maybe it's not entirely surprising, right? I mean, you have a kind of hotbed of comics studies scholars and creators over there.
Well, it's actually sort of funny. So I didn't do my PhD in Oregon. I did my MA. I did my PhD in Montreal.
Okay.
So what? But it's funny because obviously now Oregon is this hotbed of comic studies, as you say, and it really wasn't at all when I was there. Although it was where I took this one seminar I mentioned about comics or graphic novels. And that's sort of what got me back into comics. But at that time, Ben Saunders, who's now sort of I guess he's the director of comic studies there, he was a Renaissance scholar, and I didn't really know that he had anything to do with comics, so that wasn't obvious at all from my interactions with him when I was there. So it is a sort of funny coincidence that I was there, but I was there before it turned into what it is now, and I didn't really, I can trace my academic interest in comics to the University of Oregon, but not in the obvious way of having been a student in the comics program there, or having really worked with anybody in a large capacity for comics work.
Yeah.
So it's a funny coincidence, and I always think about just sort of this like weird missed timeline or something of having just been there a little bit too early. But
well, you've got your own program now going. So, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. But so in like autobiographical comics, you were saying that there's just like such a resplendence of autobiography comics being published right now. But you're specifically interested in, creators that have been otherwise kind of underrepresented. Julie Doucet, so sort of sexuality and gender, Phoebe Gloeckner, right? Ariel Schrag, Davison, and of course Toufic El Rassai. So yeah, tell us why. I mean, there has been work done on autobiography and comics, but tell us what distinguishes Serial Selves from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the main idea for the book is that when authors from marginalized backgrounds take control of representation of themselves, like interesting things happen, right? So the obvious, sort of very well established approach to studying whether that's Hilary Shue in Graphic Women or work by yourself also, right, is that there's something that happens when creators of comics get to not only write or describe themselves, but also get to draw themselves, to insist on this kind of visual representation, right? And then what happens in those cases, and you have books like Hilary Shue's Graphic Women that takes a very sort of in-depth view of that from the perspective of gender, and obviously a lot of your work looks at this from the perspective of race and ethnicity. But what I'm doing in this book is I'm taking a sort of even broader view, and I'm looking at work by authors who I guess are sort of marginalized in different ways, attempting to see how they, in different ways, engage with this visual form. And also, and I think this is the crucial contribution, or at least I hope this is the crucial contribution of the book, is that these kinds of representations are always in conversation with a long tradition of stereotype or caricature or exclusionary visual work that typifies or that otherwise reduce people to their appearances, right? So whether that's a tradition of sort of over-sexualized women in superhero comics, or whether it's sort of this, I guess, broader cultural tradition of exhibiting disabled people as freak shows, or sort of, something to be stared at or looked at, or objectified in that way. Or in the case of race and ethnicity, right? Like actual like racist caricature, or racist stereotype, and there's like obviously a really long tradition in comics for that. So what I'm looking at in the book is how these authors engage with these kinds of traditions and carve out a space for respectful, insistent self-representation that is always in conversation with these kinds of exclusionary traditions. So, for example, for the Toufic El Rassai chapter, what I do is I outline like how he works against this use of stereotypes of Arab people in comics and I guess sort of the culture much more broadly, especially post 9/11. And so how does he avoid falling into some of those traps that the form also sort of almost invariably produces, right? So if you sort of think about comics as a visual language that relies on stereotype and caricature in order to communicate quickly, efficiently, then it becomes a visual language of stereotype, of caricature, of things that very easily then turn into, for example, noxious racist stereotype, right? And so how does El Rassai, how does he avoid that? How does he engage with that? How does he carve out a space for himself for self-representation in a visual tradition that is often outright hostile to him and to his visual identity?
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, great. I love it. You also, very importantly, have chosen to edit a book series. Tell me why this is important. Why, to kind of curate a space like this.
Right. So this is a series on gender, sexuality, and comics from Rutgers, and the idea came to me when I was I go to a lot of conferences, and it was just evident to me that some of the most interesting work in comic studies is being done in this area of gender and sexuality studies, right? And especially among the sort of graduate students or other early career scholars who are doing really, really interesting work and really sort of cutting edge material is being produced at these conferences, and I felt that it would be a good idea to set up the series for so Routledge's focus is sort of a format that Routledge works with that publishes short form scholarship. So it's between 25,000 and 45,000 words books, so shorter books with a quick turnaround time. So from, I think, delivery of the manuscript to publication, we're aiming for something like 3 months. So compared to traditional academic publishing, there's a very quick turnaround, and I think that there's a great opportunity for this kind of cutting edge work to be published in this format. Anyway, so I approached Routledge with this idea, and I said, there's all this work being done, and I think a lot of it could benefit from this kind of quick turnaround, short form, but obviously academically rigorous and so forth as well. but a slightly faster moving, shorter format to really take advantage of some of this interesting work that's being done. So that's what we're doing, and we're currently, so it's a new series, and we're currently putting the final touches on the first 2 books that are coming out this summer on gender and sexuality issues in Batman comics, and also on militarism and feminism in Wonder Woman and Miss Marvel comics. So 2 really interesting titles that were written like just last month or very recently, right? And are coming out in a couple of months. So are these are books that are able to write about like very current developments in the lives of these characters and have them come out very quickly thereafter. So we also have books on feminism in Nordic comics, on infertility comics, on gender roles in cosplay, on British teen comics. So all these things are coming out. So we're aiming for sort of a very broad range of material. But this is just sort of the first batch of books coming out. So I'm very excited about this series, and I think it has the potential to really just produce some really interesting studies to really I guess like accelerate the study of these issues in comic studies. And the response has been so great that we've recently launched a companion series also of more traditional length manuscripts, because as soon as we started advertising this, people were getting in touch saying, well, this sounds really great, but I have a longer book that I would like to propose. And so we set up a companion series that will publish that.
Very exciting, and I'm so glad that it's moving so quickly as a way to rigorously kind of expand the field in this sort of rapid way that you're talking about. You also are directing this comics program at the University of East Anglia. We were talking earlier about your own experience in that one seminar that kind of opened you back to the space of comic studies. But yeah, tell us a little bit about this is another space that you're creating, curating, directing for comic studies.
Yeah. So when I arrived at in this job at the University of East Anglia, I'm in the Department of American Studies, and it they were very supportive of me doing comics, and were like excited. They hired me on the strength of my work, and hired me to teach comics and do work in comics, but there wasn't anything like a program or anything like that. But then I arrived, and I feel like this is my experience at all the institutions I've been at or been associated with, is that as soon as you start sort of to poke around a bit, you'll find that there are a lot of people around who are interested in comics academically, and then do work and publish a little bit, or go to conferences, or do some kind of work in comics without really having it their main gig the way that it is mine. So I started doing that, and I found that there are a lot of people at UEA who work on comics. So I started to sort of have informal meetings with them and see what could come of that. And then it occurred to me that we have critical mass here. We have enough people to set up a master's in comic studies, one of very few in the world at this point. So maybe because I was new to the university and hadn't quite had my spirits crushed yet by the bureaucracy of a large institution like that, I just decided, well, let's see if we can make this happen. Let's see what it takes. How much work and what kind of work, and how would I set up this master's, and it turned out that everybody were really supportive of it, and I feel incredibly fortunate that people were so supportive of something relatively unproven at all levels of the university, right? Like the dean of the faculty is really excited about it, and it's great to have this kind of support for something that is offbeat in most people's eyes. the sort of the byproduct of this kind of approach to it is that it's a truly interdisciplinary program. So we're launching this September 2020, and because it's drawing on people from all over campus, it's a really interdisciplinary program, and students will be able to take courses in art history and in film and media studies, in politics, and in a whole range of different subjects that are related to comics and visual studies in some way. So in addition to there obviously being sort of core comics courses, seminars that people are going to be taken, they can also, students can find their own way through the program from their own interests. So if students come to us and they're really interested in adaptation theory or in movies or television, then there's an angle into comic studies that they can follow from the film and television studies department, and similarly from art history and other departments. So it's a really I think a really exciting way to think about comic studies, to think about not think about comics studies as something that we box in and we look at it from one particular perspective, but something that really opens up the university to students, right? That really is like a way in. They're in the comic studies program, but the university is open to them, and they can follow their own interests around. So it's a 1-year program on the UK model, and yeah, so we launch in 2020. Applications are now open. So if anybody out there is interested in joining us, please send us an application. It is one of those things. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, it's one of those things where it's really, if I'm honest, it's difficult to sort of gauge the demand for something like this, right? Because everybody is very excited about the prospect of it, and the university keeps asking, how many students, and it's hard for me to give a good estimate of that. And I think especially now with everything going on in the world, like everything is just sort of thrown into a bit of chaos here. So we're launching, but we have faith in the program, and we're hoping to build it over time also.
Well, it's certainly an exciting moment for you, and I think a great model for us to look to for ways that the humanities can grow in the 21st century, right? In a very interdisciplinary way. What about your own teaching in comics? I know you've written on this, but yeah, can you share some of your, Frederik sort of trademarks here in the classroom?
Sure. So this book here just came out from University of Mississippi Press, and I have a chapter in there that I co-wrote with Nick Sistanis, who was my colleague when I was a postdoc at the University of Calgary. And so him and I were postdocs together in Calgary, working with Bart Beatty there, and we found ourselves teaching, or we became friends, and we found ourselves teaching this comics course. And so when Susan Kirtley, who's one of the editors of this book, asked if we wanted to write something about our experience co-teaching a comics class for this book, we jumped at that opportunity. So that collaboration really is the basis for this one chapter. And the sort of interesting thing about that collaboration was also that obviously Nick is sort of he's an educator, a comics maker, and I'm much more of sort of traditional academic literature person, right? So there's an interesting combination of approaches that we had there, and so we came up with all kinds of just unusual, funny, interesting assignments for our students or approaches to teaching, and we just really really just bouncing ideas of each other for the duration of that course. And it was a really rewarding teaching experience, I think, for both of us. And it has really informed my own teaching since then. So what I like to do when I teach is I like to integrate. Well, so one of the challenges of teaching and I teach until this new master's program launches, I teach in a fairly, I teach like literature type courses. And so the challenge in those types of courses is to get students to think about the comics as comics and not just treat them as narrative, the way that they would treat, a novel or something, right? Like it's hard to get students to think about form when you teach like traditional literature. And I think it's hard to win when you teach comics because students are not really trained in thinking about form. They're not really trained in thinking about how stories are told, how does a form influence the content. So in order to do that, I've devised all these different assignments to really, from the very first class, get students to think about form. Like how is the fact that this text is a comic contribute to how we understand it? And I think there's something, the whole sort of idea of like, learning by doing or whatever you want to call it, but there's really something about that, because when you think about how students learn to learn about literature, they also learn about literature by writing essays, which is the same thing as using words in specific ways for a particular effect, right? So I think that there's a similar thing to be gained when you ask students to draw, to make comics, right? They learn how to analyze comics by working in the same form, in the same way that they learn how to analyze literature by writing essays, right? And so I make students draw in every class, whether it's just sort of short little assignments or more elaborate things. But my course is always designed to have this sort of trajectory of more and more advanced comics making throughout, right? So the first few weeks we doodle, we draw short little things. We just make sure we put pen to paper in every class. And then that gradually develops into sort of more comprehensive visual analysis or sort of full-on comics making, where they have to make and this is not my own assignment. I forget where I first encountered this, but I've pretty much like made my own now, and it's in every class I teach, is to ask students to review a comic in comics form, right? To engage with a comic on its own term and try to put it, put their analysis or their evaluation of this comic into comics form. So the trajectory, as I was saying, is always just towards more and more comics, and then at the end, I have my students sort of apply everything they've learned to a traditional essay, and so see like, okay, like now that we spent like all term, not writing essays, like what happens if we put all these skills, all this knowledge into traditional essay writing. And or I devise some other sort of more experimental format for the final assignment. But the students tend to really like that final essay, where they then get to like sort of return to this form that they're very familiar with from previous work, but bringing a new perspective of formal visual analysis to it.
Yeah, that's really great. I look forward to one day sitting in on one of your classes, Frederik. So obviously autobiography, sexuality, gender, these are important areas for you and your work and opening those spaces for others. But what most excites you today in the study of comics? And maybe what comics are exciting for you as well? Yeah.
Well, in the study of comics, I think I'm really excited just about like how quickly the field is growing, right? Like even just like in the last 5 years, like when I first started going to comics conferences maybe 10 years ago, there weren't that many, and you could keep up with all the books and you knew all the people, and it was a small world, right? And now it is completely exploded, right? Like it's impossible to keep up. There's 5 books every month. I can't keep up anymore at all, and that's exciting, right? That's a sign of a healthy field, discipline, whatever we might want to call it. And at the same time as that, the sort of development of new institutions, organizations, and outlets for comics. So whether that's my own comic series that I'm editing, or our MA in comic studies, or whether it's the organizations like the Comic Studies Society or the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics, or it's the Nick Sasanis' Comic Studies minor at San Francisco State University, or all these sort of instances of institutionalization of comics. I think that's a really exciting development. It's not this fringe thing that people sort of sneak in the back door anymore, or do on their own time once they've taught all the classes that they have to teach, and now finally they can teach the comics class or something. And so I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about the diversity of perspectives that are coming out, both in terms of the comics being produced, but also in terms of comics studies, right? So when I started going to conferences 5 or 10 years ago, most of the other people talking about comics were talking about, they were demographically very similar, and they tended to talk about superhero comics. That was not exactly what I was the most interested in, and still isn't really. But when I go to conferences now, it's a completely different scenario, right? Like the last 5 or 10 years have really turned that upside down, and now there's work being done on all aspects of comics, and I think that's really, really exciting. So that's what I'm really excited about in comics and comic studies. In terms of comics, I don't know. I'm finding myself still drawn to autobiographical comics. I feel like there's like something there that I can't really place it in terms of my own sort of there's the intellectual fascination with this kind of material, but there's also just something I really like when I read something and I feel like I'm connecting with the artist in some way, right? So whether that's whether that's because of the story, or whether I agree with like the political view being presented, or what that is, but there's something about that connection with the author that I find especially, there's something, I think it's built into comics, right? Because you see the author on the page, not even just when they draw themselves, but you see the drawings, you see the trace of the artist there on the page, and there's just something so intimate about that, and I find myself just drawn to those kinds of the more personal, the more sort of wacky comics. My favorite comics from the last 5 years is by Gabby Schultz. I don't know if you know him. So the comic Sick is a mind-blowingly good comic about this one time that he was really, really sick, and he started hallucinating and having all these thoughts about his own complicity in sort of this mindless American consumer culture that he sees around him, and so he starts hallucinating about that, and it becomes a very politically loaded comic about the way I read this comic about whiteness, about his own whiteness, about his own his own responsibility as a white American man, and so I wrote an article about that that's coming out in Inks, the Comics Society journal, sometime later this year. So that's something that I'm very excited about at the moment. It's people using comics for those kinds of like wide-ranging political critiques.
Wonderful. Frederik Køhlert, University of East Anglia, Director of Comics Studies. thank you so much for joining me and sharing your story with us.
Thanks for having me. That was really fun.